video of our multi-video seller series, we shall look at buyer pre-occupancy, seller post-occupancy, and the honouring of rental commitments. A buyer and seller may agree for a buyer to move into the home before the closing has taken place, or for a seller to remain in the home for a certain amount of time after the closing has taken place. Sometimes the home may convey with an obligation for the buyer to honour either the remainder of a long-term lease or several shorter vacation-type rental bookings. Here are 8 things you should know about these 4 scenarios.
Number 1. Buyer pre-occupancy. In a situation where the home is vacant or a seller is able to move out prior to closing, a seller and buyer may contractually agree for the buyer to pre-occupy the home for a period of time prior to closing. Usually this happens because the buyer has either already sold his or her home or has come to the end of a rental lease and hence no longer has a home. The exact duration of that time period will depend on what is optimal for the buyer and possible for the seller. The seller and buyer may agree that this is to be at no cost to the buyer if the seller feels that the buyer has already presented a very appealing offer, or the seller may ask for the buyer to pay for this privilege.
Number 2. Risks associated with buyer pre-occupancy. So the buyer and seller have agreed for the buyer to pre-occupy the home. This may sound like a nice amicable situation, but what happens if the buyer for financing or some other reason should then fail to close on the home? What are the possible risks to the seller? The buyer may prove to be a difficult person to now remove from the home since the buyer was without a home and still has nowhere to go. The seller could find him or herself having to deal expensively with an eviction, paying out for attorney costs. Additionally, once the buyer has exited the home may not be in the nice pristine condition that it was when the buyer moved in, and the seller may need to spend some money to restore the home to its former glory. If the buyer is being charged money for pre-occupancy, the seller could run into problems collecting the agreed upon funds.
Number 3. Seller post-occupancy. Sometimes it may benefit a seller to remain in the home after the closing has taken place. The seller may still need to find a replacement home, or perhaps the seller has already contracted on a home purchase but has not closed on the new home yet. This is frequently the case when a seller is having to wait several months for the completion of a newly built home. If the buyer is purchasing the home with either cash or using an investment type loan, then the buyer is able to charge the seller a certain amount of rent for the post-occupancy. Primary and secondary home loan programs generally will allow for a seller to remain in the home for a short period of time, but will not allow the buyer to charge the seller any rent. Most primary home loans will also require that the buyer takes up residence in the home no later than 60 days after the closing.
Number 4. Risks associated with seller post-occupancy. The risks associated with seller post-occupancy are somewhat similar to the buyer pre-occupancy, except now it's a case of the seller not being willing to leave the home on the agreed upon date. This could be due to perhaps the seller's home purchase running late or falling through, and the buyer is now having to take legal action to remedy the situation. It could be that, similar to the buyer's pre-occupancy, the condition of the home is also compromised. The buyer may find him or herself moving into a home that is not in the same pristine condition that it was when the buyer performed the final walkthrough of the home on the day of closing. Again, as in the case of pre-occupancy, if a rental amount was agreed upon by the buyer and seller, it could be that the seller is not forthcoming with the agreed upon amount.
Number 5. Honouring a long-term lease. If the buyer and seller agree to the buyer honouring an existing long-term lease and hence inheriting a tenant on the day of closing, one of the contract stipulations will be that the seller provide the buyer with a copy of the long-term lease. This allows the buyer to clearly see the terms and conditions of the tenancy and hence can be sure that he or she is happy to have a tenant stay in their home under the terms of the existing lease. A point of note is that a tenant who is in good standing with rental payments in most cases must have his or her lease honoured by the buyer and cannot be made to move out of the home before the end of the lease. Additionally, the lease cannot be altered in any way without the tenant's permission. Any deposit held by the seller and any rent prorations for the month in which the closing is taking place will be handled by the closing company on the settlement statement.
Number 6. Risks associated with honouring a long-term lease. As with pre-occupancy and post-occupancy, which we have already mentioned, the same 3 risks are potentially present in the case of honouring a long-term rental lease. The tenant may not be agreeable to moving out at the end of the lease, leading to the buyer having to carry out an eviction. The home may be left in a less than desirable condition, or the tenant may default on the monthly rental payments. These risks, however, are no different than those to be faced by an investor buyer finding a tenant of their own to move in post-closing.
Number 7. Honouring short-term rental bookings. When we are dealing with the sale of a vacation home, there are often rental bookings that must be honoured by the buyer. This is both helpful to the seller, who does not wish to disappoint vacationing guests, and also a benefit to the buyer in providing the buyer with some immediate rental income. If this is going to be the case, then a list of all the bookings, together with the dates and amount of the money to be levied, will be agreed upon by both the buyer and seller at the time of contract. Again, any deposits or prorated rental amounts will be handled by the closing company on the settlement statement.
Number 8. Risks associated with honouring short-term rental bookings. The risks associated with honouring short-term rental bookings are fairly minimal, especially if the buyer intends in any case to use the home in this fashion as a money-generating investment. It is usual for a buyer, especially one not living locally, to employ the services of a management agent. The management agent will supervise the day-to-day operation of the home and thereby also will make sure that the inherited rental bookings are taken care of and do not present any issues for the buyer. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the rest of the videos in this seller series.